Good evening. It is absolute pleasure and privilege to be here. And I want to thank everyone who has made it possible for me to be here and to be with this wonderful, wonderful group of authors. I think I was telling Christina, maybe I wasn't. Before I give a talk, I usually go over it, write it, rewrite it, change it, write it, rewrite it, change it. Then I come, and sometimes I hear with the first speaker, I decide to change it, and that's what I did. Again, it's terrible. And one of the reasons I did this again is that every time I come to a place like this, the same thing happens. I start thinking one of the best things about books is the way they connect you to people you should be connected to. Not people you meet because you have to, through your work, through family, or where you're born, but people who share the same dreams, people who share the same kind of passion with you. And so tonight I thought, rather than just speaking about what it meant to be an author, I wanted to talk about what it meant to me to be a reader. Because before I became a writer, I was a reader. And nowadays, especially in this amazing country that sort of people think about or dream about as a land of ideas and dreams itself, where both reading and writing has been so denigrated, so constantly not come under attack, so constantly been sort of neglected. I think that it is fitting for us to sort of exchange as readers, and I keep thinking of these words from Vladimir Nabokov. He used to say, readers are born free, and they ought to remain free. Now, we always think about writers, about freedom of expression, about defending writers when their freedom of expression is taken away from you. But I always come back to the question, what about millions of readers? What about their right to have access to all kinds of books? And what about their rights to be able to discuss and talk about these books freely? And it is not just in countries like Iran or China or these totalitarian societies where the right to read is taken away from you by arresting you, taking you to jail, and sometimes even executing you. I keep remembering this quotation from Ray Bradbury, one of my favorite authors, who used to say, you don't have to burn books to destroy a culture. All you have to do is to get the people not to read. And that sort of indifference is just as effective as the will to destruction. And it is that sort of indifference, I think, that is the main challenge in our society today. David, you were talking about crisis, and I think that these times are both very exciting times as well as very dangerous times, because there are times of change, there are times of questioning, and the crisis that we are confronted today is not simply an economic or a political crisis. It is, in fact, a crisis of vision. And so, in order to be able to solve the crisis, we do need, today, more than ever, ideas and imagination. We need imaginative knowledge, because imaginative knowledge is not something you have today and you can dispense of tomorrow. You can't say that from tomorrow, I really don't need to read, I really don't need to listen to music, I really don't need to see art. In effect, I really don't need to feel. I really don't need to have a heart. I really don't need to have a mind. Ever since human beings called themselves human, there was the need to imagine and to think. And this imagination and thinking was not the property of an elite. It was a way of survival. From the very first drawings in the caves, From the very first time somebody created fire, from the very first time the first word was uttered, it was the need to understand the world in order to control the world, in order to change the world, in order to be able to live in the world. And part of it is science. Nowadays, of course, one of my constant gripes these days is the fact that we have STEM and we have STEAM. But STEAM is really not all that good because art historians and philosophers don't make enough money. But STEM, my God, you know, you go after STEM and you'll get money and you come on television and you become either a celebrity or a president, you know, whichever comes first. It really doesn't matter. That sort of a thing. That sort of a thing. While I always remember, my daughter, when she went to college, she told me that she always loved literature and she always loved biology and she wanted to go into medical school, but she wanted to double major in English and biology. And I remember I told her about what Vladimir Nabokov, himself a writer, a poet, and a scientist, used to tell his students. He used to tell them, you need to have the passion of the scientist and the precision of the poet. Because both science and literature are based on that almost sexual as well. I meant, we don't believe in Freud anymore. So on that almost sensual edge, but damn it. I'm not completely sort of digressing to this friend who used to tell me that what turns you on is if somebody talks to you about a book. But anyway, that almost sensual urge to know, that curiosity which Nabokov also used to tell his students is insubordination in its purest form. So to segregate science and literature, it is almost a crime as far as I'm concerned. To tell our students not to be curious, to tell our students that, to not tell our students that the best scientists were also musicians and philosophers and thinkers. Look at Einstein. And if you want to look at, nowadays it is very fashionable to look at these young men who apparently all were in a garage and then they were inventing really amazing things and they all became billionaires and we all want to be them. We want to be Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and yada yada. But nobody reminds us that they started in that garage, whether it is mythology or not. And when they were trying to invent all these amazing things, some of which are giving us a lot of headache and trouble nowadays, when they were doing that, they weren't thinking, I'm going to fill up my pockets, I'm going to get rich. They were doing it for the love of invention and innovation. And that is how, in a democracy, we educate our children. We don't tell our children not to go into English or philosophy or whatever else because you don't make enough money. Whose fault is it? If a teacher, a librarian, an art historian, a musician, an artist, a poet is not making enough money, it is the fault of a society that was based on the legacy of enlightenment, which, by the way, that first soldier who was the first president, somebody called George Washington, he was saying that we are lucky today because we are the inheritors. We inherit what mankind up to now has not been able to have, and that is the legacy of enlightenment. Washington, Jefferson. Jefferson was completely nuts. I mean, he was saying that America is a place where the farmers could read Homer. And every time I go to these small liberal arts colleges at the heart of these very small towns that was built by farmers, I think, oh my God, America could have farmers who would be reading Homer and Aeschylus and Ovid. So the point, if there was a point to what I was trying to say, as a reader, that I'm trying to make, and I know that I'm running out of time, right? The point that I was trying to make was that the crisis that we are facing today in this country will not be solved without imagination, without allowing our children to freely, and offering them the opportunity to freely choose what they love. I keep telling students everywhere I go these days, two things. I tell them, one, that you're not here to be complacent and feel good and be comfortable. In the names of one of the greatest writers, I end my book, Republic of Imagination, with him, James Baldwin, whom I feel is very essential today. In the words of James Baldwin, artists are here to disturb the peace. We are here in colleges to disturb you, to make you question the world and to pose yourself as question marks. That is why you come to college. You don't come to be pampered. You don't come to relax thinking. Life itself. I mean, they are beheading people, for heaven's sake. They are killing young kids in Newtown. They're killing you have reports of murder in churches. And we still are trying to pamper ourselves and to protect ourselves from the Great Gatsby and Huckleberry Finn. So these are the questions that we face today. And the second thing I tell my students, and I usually do not like to advise people. I think it's very dangerous, actually, to advise people. But I always, when they come and ask me, I tell them, when they tell you, go and choose a job based on the money you make, rather than on love and on passion, remember, it is exactly like telling you, why don't you marry this rich old man? Because he will protect you, give you security and everything, instead of this really poor young man who has just started college and he has the illusion that he wants to become an English teacher. Not him. And I say, just imagine marrying that rich man. Every morning you wake up, you will feel secure, but you have to look at, I mean, there's a price to pay. There's always a price to pay. You can't get away. So you might as well enjoy life and go after that, the person you love. And the whole point about it is that we are telling our children to go after money and vocation in a democracy. In a democracy. A democracy that is supposed to provide all the members of society, each and every one of them, with quality, free education and health. This is not negotiable. This is not something you give philanthropically. This is the task and duty of a democratic society. So, the point about readers, coming back to them and finishing my points, I just wanted to tell you a few things. I just wanted to tell you, I'm so sorry, I really had written a lot. I just didn't read from it. But the reason that I wrote Republic of Imagination was that when I was finishing, my editor keeps reminding me that I was already writing this book when I finished reading Lolita in Tehran. In the last chapter of reading Lolita in Tehran, I asked the question which Saul Bellow, one of the great American writers, asked. He says, those who survived the ordeal of Holocaust, how will they survive the ordeal of freedom? For me at that time, what I worried about was that freedom is an ordeal. And if you don't look at it as an ordeal and as a responsibility and take it for granted, then you're already in deep waters. If you feel complacent about it, you're in deep waters. And when I came here, everybody would tell me, well, you lived in Iran and this regime was horrible and you lived in a lot of repression. That is why you were reading these great works of art. Why do we need to read them? As if you have to be tortured and killed in order to read Toni Morrison. There's no other way that it is not curiosity, it is not the joy, the miraculous joy of creation, discovery. It is going to jail. Either go to jail or read Marquez. You don't have any choice. So the whole point, that was why I wrote this book. And the main question that I had was, can a democracy survive without a democratic imagination? Because obviously the answer that I have is that it cannot. And I constantly go back to my own life as a reader. I started reading through listening at first. My father would tell me stories when I was very young. I was about 3 years old. And in those stories, he was so very democratic. One day he would talk about our epic poet Ferdowsi. The next day I would fly to France with the Little Prince. The next day I would go to England with Alice, to America with Charlotte's Web, to Denmark with Hans Christian Andersen. And since that early childhood, I understood that the most amazing thing about stories and storytelling, that universality that you were talking about and that variety that Christina was talking about, is that it is the most democratic thing in the world because it is the only thing in life that transcends the limitations of geography, nationality, ethnicity, race, gender. It even defeats time and space, so that a man named Dante can live side by side with a woman named Emily Dickinson, with a man named Rumi, with a woman named Jane Austen, with a man named Hafez, with a woman named Toni Morrison. And this is the only conclusive evidence that we have lived. Because not just the cruelty of men, but also the cruelty of time is what we need to resist. And the only way that we can resist it is through guarding it, those guardians of memory that you find in stories. Stories give us continuity. Stories connect us. Stories make us empathetic. That is why we need them. Not to become a real estate magnet. That is not the model I wanted my children to pursue when we migrated to this country. When we migrated to this country, I thought that I too, if I have a dream, I can actualize it. And I ask you, if we don't have knowledge, if we don't think, if we don't imagine, if we don't risk thinking and imagining, how can we even vote? The act of voting presupposes knowing about your own history, knowing about your own principles, knowing about what you want of the world, where you were before, where you are now, and where you want to be in the future. How will you have a foreign policy if you don't know others? If you don't know yourself and you don't know others, how could you have a foreign policy? How could you negotiate with the world? Even in wars, both great generals and great writers know that you cannot win a war through military alone, that you have to be able to have the empathy to put yourself in the mind of even your enemy, the way that Jane Austen or Ralph Ellison put themselves in the mind of the villains. That in this republic of imagination, everyone has the right to speak, including the villain. And so because I have been really, I think I'm now exceeding the time. So what I wanted to finish with was that when I wanted to write, I wrote Republic of Imagination in order to investigate these questions. And the first book that I read, I heard actually, about America was The Wizard of Oz. Yeah, and my tutor was trying to teach me English, and I was about 6 or 7 years old, and there was this utterly boring book that I remember nothing about. There were two kids, I think they were both blonde, I'm not sure, a boy and a girl, and they were constantly smiling. They were, I mean, maybe they were called Jack and Jill, I don't remember. And this Jack and Jill were always smiling, always polite, always nice, always happy. Never did they grumble and tell their mother, I don't want to go to school, I want to watch TV. You know, so they were really boring. And after we read about Jack and Jill, then we would go to Wizard of Oz. And I learned through Dorothy, to begin with, that there is a place in America called Kansas. And at the heart of Kansas, there is a hurricane. And at the heart of that hurricane, there is a wonderland, the land of Oz. But this orphan girl goes to Oz not to stay, but to come back to that desert and her dour relatives. Because you go back, you go to the world of imagination to come back through the alternative eyes of imagination. You see not just the desert, but that which is invisible. The beauty that the desert hides in itself. And so when I wanted to become an American citizen, I decided that I need to be an American citizen because I'm grumbling too much. When you love a place, you complain a lot. And I was complaining too much, so I thought I better become an American. And I remembered what Mark Twain said. I quote him in my book. He says, patriotism is supporting your country all of the time and your government when it deserves it. And with that in mind, you know, with Mark Twain on my side, I decided that this is the time for me to become an American. And the only place I could go in order to define what kind of American I wanted to be, because if I didn't define myself, somebody else would, was to the golden ambassadors that my father had brought to my room so many decades ago. And so I started with the orphans, because I believe in America, the orphans, the have-nots, the marginals, they are the heroes. They are at the center of American novel and at the center of American morality. I started with Twain, I ended with Baldwin for very obvious reasons, because, and I won't go into that because it's too long. And I want to end by saying that what I dream as an American, what I dream as a woman, what I dream as a teacher, what I dream as a writer, what I dream as a reader and as a human being can be summarized in one scene out of Huckleberry Finn. If you remember, Huck his conscience tells him that he's doing wrong in hiding Jim, in not giving up Jim. He believes that he'll go to hell if he doesn't give up Jim. And his conscience keeps, going at it. And he decides that he doesn't want to go to hell. So he writes a letter to Miss Watson and tells her, your runaway slave is here, come and get him. And then he says, but my horrible, wicked heart, I love it. Twain talks about this book being a conflict between a sound heart and a deformed conscience. And his heart tells him, remember all the things that Jim was to you. And he remembers that Jim was his true soulmate, that Jim was the most generous and the most worthy character in the whole novel. And he says, from that point on, I decided I can't be anything but wicked. I will remain wicked, and I tore out that page, that letter, and I said, all right then, I'll go to hell. The candidate I will vote for will be the one who says, all right then, I'll go to hell, but I'll do the right thing. Thank you so much for your patience.